In the records of the Vorthan ascendancy, the empire that had swallowed 900 worlds without once slowing its stride, the human system was filed under a single administrative category. Not a threat, not a rival, not even a curiosity worth the ink of a proper report. It was filed under the word that the imperial surveyors used for a harvest already counted, reclaimable, a field of standing grain that had not yet noticed the scythe. The assessment had been made from orbit, quietly, 3 years before the fleet ever came. A survey drone the size of a fist had drifted through the outer edge of the human system, tasting the light of their sun, counting the thin scatter of their ships, measuring the crude chemical fire of their engines. It had returned to the Ascendancy's frontier command, with numbers that made the analysts smile behind their translucent membranes. The humans burned petroleum. They still shed their dead into shallow graves in the ground. Their largest warship carried weapons that could not have scratched the paint of a Vorthan patrol cutter, and they had spread themselves thin, foolishly, greedily, across a dozen small colonies and mining stations strung out along the dark like beads on a fraying thread. Prefect Ashan Val Carrick read the report in his tower above the frontier world of Maris, and he laughed. He was a tall creature, elegant in the way the Vorthan aristocracy prized, his skin the pale silver of a knife left in moonlight, and he had conquered enough soft young species to know the smell of an easy season. He did not even summon his war council. He summoned his quartermaster. "Provision 3 subjugation carriers," he said. "Not a battle fleet, a collection fleet. We are not going to war with these creatures. We are going to inventory them." The quartermaster, a lean functionary named Sesh, bowed his narrow head. "And the terms of pacification, Prefect?" "The usual for a Category 9. Val Carrick waved a long hand at the window at the far bright point of the human sun. "Land on their largest gathering. Break whatever they call a government. Take the young and the strong for labor contracts. Take the metals, salt the rest. I want the whole system cataloged and shipped inside a single season. If a species cannot defend a planet, it does not deserve to keep one. That is not cruelty, Sesh. That is arithmetic." Sesh had served 3 prefects across 2 centuries, and he had learned that the Empire's cruelties were always dressed as arithmetic. He did not argue. He filed the requisition, and somewhere in the great machinery of the Ascendancy, a decision that would end 31 worlds and a 200-year dynasty was stamped, sealed, and forgotten before the ink had dried. The humans, of course, knew none of this yet. Out on the ragged edge of their own small sphere, on a mining station called Halcyon Drift that hung above a cracked gray moon, a young man named Cass Renner was 17 days from the worst and best week of his life, and he was, at that particular moment, arguing with a machine that would not give him his lunch. Cass was 19 years old and built like a boy who had done a man's work too early, all long forearms and knuckles gone thick from wrenches, a face that still could not quite grow the beard it kept attempting. He had been born on Halcyon Drift and had never once left it. His mother had died in the Orcracker's 3rd level when he was 11, and his father had followed her into the dark 2 winters later, coughing out silica in the station infirmary, leaving Cass to the guardianship of the station itself, which was to say, to no one. He had learned early that the station kept nobody it could not use, so he had made himself useful. By 19, he could talk to any machine on the drift the way other people talked to old dogs, low and patient and unafraid, and most of them answered him. This one would not. The nutrient dispenser in the low-deck galley had jammed for the 4th time that cycle, and Cass crouched with his shoulder against its warm flank, coaxing. "Come on," he murmured. "You know me, it's just a valve." "It's always just a valve with you." He worked his multi-tool into the seam, felt the sticky resistance of a fouled solenoid, and popped it clear. The machine shuddered and coughed a brick of gray protein into the tray. Cass caught it before it hit the floor. "There, was that so hard, you dramatic old thing?" A voice behind him, dry as recycled air. "You talk to it like it can hear you." It can hear me, Cass said without turning. He knew the voice. Everyone on the drift knew the voice. It just pretends it can't, same as you, Das. Old Das Yarrow leaned in the galley hatch with his arms folded, a station foreman going bald and going soft and going nowhere, and he watched the boy with the particular affection of a man who has decided, against his own better judgment, to care about someone. Station Council wants the low deck online by second shift. You'll have it. I'll have it. Cass wiped his hands on the rag looped through his belt. Das, the long range came back last night on the astronomy array. Das's face did not change, but something behind it did. Cass, I know I'm not supposed to run the array. You're not supposed to run the array. There's something moving in the outer dark. Cass stood, and though he was trying to keep his voice level, the thing that was in him would not quite stay pressed down. 3 big returns, cold, coming in slow but coming in straight, and they're not on any lane we trade. They came out of the deep between the stars, Das, from the empty side, and they're pointed right at us. He held up his slate and the plot glowed there, 3 fat crimson marks crawling across a field of black. That's not a comet. That's not a survey, that's a course. For a long moment the old foreman said nothing. Out beyond the galley's single scarred port, the cracked moon turned its gray face to the sun, indifferent. Then Das unfolded his arms, and he seemed suddenly to be exactly as old as he was. Show the council, he said quietly. Not the whole council, show Renata, only Renata. Cass had shown Renata. That was the trouble. That was the whole trouble, and it was why the boy had not slept. Halcyon Drift was not a rich station, but it was not a stupid one either. 2 centuries of scratching a living out of the black had taught the humans of the outer colonies to notice things, and to distrust the things they noticed, and Renata Vane had built her small, quiet life out of noticing and distrusting. She had been a shipping controller once back when the Drift still had shipping. Now she was 60 and sharp as a fresh cut, and she ran what passed for the station's real government from a room full of dead screens that she had personally kept alive with solder and spite. When Cass had put his 3 crimson marks in front of her, she had looked at them for a long time, and then she had said a thing that Cass would remember later in the worst of it, and hold onto like a handrail in the dark. They came from the empty side, she'd said. Nobody comes from the empty side unless they don't want to be seen coming, and nobody hides their approach from people they mean to trade with. She had tapped the glass once over the largest of the 3 marks. Somebody thinks we're already theirs, Cass. They just haven't told us yet. She was right. She was more right than she knew. The 3 shapes that fell toward Halcyon Drift out of the starless deep were Vorthan subjugation carriers, and they had been built for exactly one purpose: to arrive at a defenseless world and make it the Empire's. Each was a blunt black wedge 4 kilometers along its spine, windowless, ugly, more foundry than warship, its holds designed to be filled with whatever a conquered people could be made to yield. They carried no great cannon because they expected to face no great defense. They carried instead harvesters, cutting drones, contract collars by the 10,000 humming in their racks, waiting to be locked around the throats of the young and the strong. And on the bridge of the lead carrier, the unarguable, a subjugation-master named Thel Vex Oran looked at the small human station growing in his forward display, and felt the pleasant boredom of a professional who has done a thing so many times it has stopped being interesting. Oran was not an aristocrat like the prefect who had sent him. He was a career pacifier, low-born and efficient, and he had broken 40 worlds without ever once being surprised. He had a face like a folded blade and a voice that never rose because it had never needed to. He watched the human station turn on its axis, a rusting wheel of scavenged metal, and he read its energy signature off his board with the disdain of a man reading a beggar's coat. Population subjugation-master, his second asked. 11,000 give or take. Oran did not look up. Mining stock, malnourished, no planetary defense grid, no orbital batteries, no fleet worth the word. There is a single armed cutter registered to the station and it has not moved in 6 years. He allowed himself the ghost of what might have been a smile. "This is not a battle. This is a delivery we are picking up. Broadcast the standard demand. Give them one rotation to surrender their governing body. Then we begin collection." The demand came to halcyon drift in the middle of what the humans called the night, though there was no night in the black, only the station's habit of dimming its lights to remember the planet none of them had ever seen. It came on every channel at once, overriding the music in the low-deck bars and the lullabies in the creche and the private slates of 11,000 people, and it spoke to them in their own language, which was somehow the most frightening thing of all, because it meant these strangers had been listening long enough to learn how to be understood. "I am the voice of the Vorthan ascendancy," it said, and it did not sound cruel, which was worse. "Your system has been assessed and claimed. You will assemble your governing body at your primary docking spine within one rotation of your world to receive the terms of your reclamation. Resistance will be recorded and answered. Compliance will be recorded and rewarded. You are not being attacked. You are being collected. Do not make this more difficult than arithmetic requires." Then the channels went quiet, and 11,000 human beings sat in the dimmed light of a rusting wheel above a cracked moon and understood, all at once and all together, that something enormous and patient had decided they were not people at all. They were inventory. In the room full of dead screens, Renata Vane listened to the message twice, and then a third time, her lined face unreadable in the glow. Das Yarrow stood by the hatch with his fists closed, and Cass Renner, who had found the 3 marks in the dark and had not slept since, stood between them and felt the fear come up in him like water in a flooding shaft, cold and rising, and heard under it, faint and strange, another thing he did not yet have a name for. "They think it's over," Renata said at last. She said it slowly, turning it the way she turned everything. "Listen to how they say it, collected, reclaimed. They're not threatening us. You don't threaten a warehouse. They've already decided how this ends. In their heads we're already loaded." She looked up, and her eyes found Cass, the boy who talked to machines, the boy nobody had ever kept because they could not use him, and something moved in her face that he would not understand until much later. "That's a mistake," she said. "That's the only mistake they've made, but it might be enough." "Renata," Das's voice was heavy. "We have one cutter. We have mining charges and cutting lasers and 11,000 people who have never held a weapon. They have 3 warships. What are we going to do, throw ore at them?" "No," Renata stood. She was a small woman and she did not become larger when she stood, but the room seemed to arrange itself around her anyway. "We're going to do what people like us have always done when something bigger than us decided we were free for the taking. We're going to make ourselves expensive." She looked again at Cass. "You found them. You've been in the guts of every machine on this drift since you could walk. I need you to answer me one thing, and I need the truth, not the answer you think I want." Cass swallowed. "Ask." "Every ship they've got," Renata said. "Every drone, every collar, every cutting beam, it's a machine." "Isn't it?" And Cass Renner, 19 years old, who had never left the station he was born on, who had lost everyone the black had ever given him, looked at the old woman in the room full of dead screens, and felt the nameless thing under his fear finally show him its face. It was not courage. He would tell people, years later, that it was never courage, not really. It was something older and meaner and more human than that. It was the flat refusal of a creature that has already lost everything to be counted before it is dead. "Yeah," he said, "it's a machine." He wiped his hands on the rag at his belt, an old habit, the gesture of a boy about to start a difficult job. "And machines listen to me." Out in the dark, the unarguable and its 2 sisters closed the last of the distance, patient, certain, bored. On the bridge of the lead carrier, subjugation-master Oran watched the rotation counter tick toward 0 and thought about nothing at all, because there was nothing here worth thinking about. He had broken 40 worlds. He would break this one before the season turned. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was done. He was wrong about the arithmetic. He had counted the ships and the guns and the malnourished 11,000, and he had counted correctly, and it would not matter, because he had left one number out of the sum. He had not counted what a cornered thing will do when it has decided it would rather be expensive than owned. No Vorthan survey had a column for that. It was the single quantity the Empire had never learned to measure in 900 worlds of conquest, because until now it had never met a species stubborn enough to make it the whole equation. The rotation counter reached 0. The demand went unanswered. And on Halcyon Drift, in the dimmed and rusting dark, a boy who talked to machines began, very quietly, to teach the Empire the one number it had forgotten how to fear. The first thing Cass Renner did was steal a language. The Vorthan demand had come to the station on every channel, and every channel was a door, and Cass had spent his whole life learning that no door on Halcyon Drift was ever truly locked, only latched by people who assumed nobody would bother to reach for it. He sat in the astronomy loft with Renata's oldest slate across his knees, and he pulled the broadcast apart the way he pulled apart a fouled valve, patient and low and unafraid, and inside the smooth imperial voice he found the machine language underneath it, the raw handshake code that the carriers used to speak to their own drones. It was elegant. It was arrogant. It assumed that no one at the other end would ever be listening, because no one at the other end had ever been anything but cattle. They didn't encrypt it, he said, half to himself, half to the machine. They didn't bother. Why would you lock a barn door against the cows? Can you use it? Renata was behind him, close, watching the code scroll. Not yet, Cass rubbed his eyes. He had not slept in 2 days, and the fear had settled into a low, permanent hum behind his teeth. It's a handshake, not a key. If I answer them in their own protocol, their machines will treat me like one of their machines, for exactly as long as it takes a real Vorthan mind to notice a voice that shouldn't be talking. Seconds, maybe less. It's not a way in. It's a window I can hold open with my fingers before it takes them off. Then we need them looking somewhere else, Renata said, when the window opens. That was the shape of it, in the end. That was the whole shape of the thing they built in the days that followed, in the dimmed and frightened dark of a station that had 1 week to become something the Empire could not simply pick up. They could not outshoot the carriers. They could not outarmor them or outrun them. But Renata Vane had spent 60 years learning that the strong are only strong along the axis they expect to be tested, and that everything else about them is soft. The Vorthans expected to be tested by guns, so the humans of Halcyon Drift resolved, very deliberately, to never once show them a gun. They would show them instead a mess, a stubborn, expensive, humiliating mess. But a mess needs room to grow, and time was the one thing the Empire had not offered. So the second thing Cass Renner did, the thing that Renata argued against for a full hour, and then, being Renata, turned into a weapon, was answer the Vorthans not with surrender and not with defiance, but with the oldest human trick there is. He answered them with a lie so mundane it was almost insulting. The message that went up from Halcyon Drift to the unarguable, in halting, deferential, machine-translated Vorthan, said this: the station governing body has received your terms and wishes to comply. Assembling 11,000 persons, and their labor records for orderly collection, requires the completion of our current shift cycle to avoid loss of the ore stock you are here to claim. We request 4 rotations to prepare an orderly inventory. We do not wish to damage your property. We do not wish to damage your property. Renata had written that line herself, and she had smiled a small, terrible smile writing it. Give a strong man something to be lazy about, she said, and he'll thank you for the excuse. On the bridge of the unarguable, subjugation-master Oren read the request and felt, for the first time, a flicker of something. Not suspicion. Oren was too experienced to feel suspicion at a beaten thing rolling over. What he felt was the mild pleasure of a job made easier than expected. A cooperative subject population meant fewer collars broken in the taking, fewer laborers damaged, a cleaner ledger. He granted 3 rotations instead of 4. One must always take something, so that the subject remembers who is counting. And he settled his carriers into a slow, patient orbit above the rusting wheel, and he did not deploy his boarding drones, and he let his crews stand down to half-watch, because there was nothing here to watch. He had bought the humans 3 days. He thought he had bought them a leash. And then, on the second of those 3 days, the 4th ship arrived, and everything Cass Renner had planned went sideways, and the whole affair became the tangled, 3-cornered thing that would eventually be taught in the war colleges of a dozen species under the name humans give it now. The Halcyon Reckoning. The 4th ship came from the trade side, not the empty side, which was the first strange thing about it. It was smaller than the carriers and far uglier, a scavenger's hull grown over decades like a reef, patched in 9 colors of salvaged plate, bristling with the mismatched teeth of weapons bought and stolen, and pried off the dead across half the sector. It broadcast no imperial code. It broadcast instead a trade hail on the open human bands, in a purring, amused, entirely too fluent human voice, and it addressed itself not to the Vorthan carriers at all but directly, insolently, to Halcyon Drift. Little wheel, the voice said, I see you've got company, big gray company, the kind that files you under reclaimable and doesn't blink. I know their smell. I've made a living in their leavings for 30 years. My name is Vashti Serrano, and my ship is the second mistake, and I am what your grandmothers would have called a very bad woman. But I'm a very bad woman who hates the ascendancy more than she loves her own skin, and I have come a long way on a rumor that somebody out here found a way to talk to Vorthan machines. She let that hang. Was the rumor true, little wheel? Because if it was true, you and I are about to be the best friends either of us has ever had. In the astronomy loft, Cass went very still. How does she know that? Renata's face had closed like a fist. Somebody talked. Somebody on a supply run, somebody who heard a rumor and sold it for passage. She was already moving, already recalculating, the way she recalculated everything. It doesn't matter how, it matters what she is. Cass, that ship is a scavenger. That woman lives off the Empire the way rats live off a granary. She's not here to save us. She's here because a station that can talk to Vorthan machines is the richest salvage she's ever smelled, and she wants it before the carriers grind it into the moon. So she's an enemy. No, and here Renata smiled again, the terrible small smile, because she had spent 60 years learning that the world is not made of friends and enemies but of appetites, and appetites can be aimed. She's a third hunger at the table. And we are a very small station between a very large empire and a very hungry thief, and both of them want the same thing from us, and neither of them thinks we're smart enough to notice we're the only ones holding it. She turned to Cass, and her old eyes were bright and cold. That's not 2 enemies, Cass. That's a lever, if I'm careful, if you're fast. If neither of them ever once believes the boy who talks to machines is the most dangerous thing in this whole black sky. She paused. Which they won't. Because we're prey. That's the whole gift of it. That's the only card we'll ever be dealt, and it's a better card than either of them knows. They let Vashti Serrano dock. It was, Das Yarrow said afterward, like inviting a wolf into a house full of children because there was a bear at the door, but Das said it with grudging admiration because it worked, and because the woman who came off the second mistake was not what any of them expected. Vashti Serrano was human. That was the first shock. She was somewhere past 50, lean and scarred and dressed in the layered leathers of a dozen ports, with a mechanical left hand that clicked when she flexed it and eyes that had learned to price everything they landed on. She had been born, she said, on a colony the ascendancy had reclaimed 40 years before. She did not say what had happened to it. She did not need to. Everyone in that room had just heard the word reclaimable spoken about their own home, and they understood exactly what a woman looked like who had heard it spoken about hers and lived. So, Vashti said, dropping into a chair in Renata's room of dead screens like she owned it, her metal hand clicking as she laced her fingers. The rumor's true. You've got a way in. Don't bother lying. I watched you send them a stall message in their own protocol, which means you cracked their handshake, which means you are exactly what I came for. She leaned forward. Here's my offer, and it's the only honest one you'll get in this whole affair, so savor it. I have guns. Real guns, Vorthan killers, the kind you scavenge off the wrecks of people who thought they could take the Empire head-on and were wrong. You have a boy who can whisper to their drones. Neither of us can beat 3 subjugation carriers alone. Together, she spread her scarred hands. Together we can make those 3 carriers a wreck field, and I will take my salvage cut off the top, the reactors, the metals, the intact drones, and you will get to keep this ugly little wheel and your 11,000 lives, which is more than the ascendancy was going to leave you. That's the deal. It's a good deal. It's a better deal than Prey ever gets. There was a silence. Cass looked at Renata. Renata looked at Vashti Serrano for a long, long moment, and Cass watched the old woman price the scavenger exactly as coldly as the scavenger was pricing them. And he understood in that moment that he was standing in a room with 2 of the most dangerous minds he would ever meet, and that they had just recognized each other, and that neither of them trusted the other 1 atom's width. You'll take your cut off the top, Renata said slowly, which means you need the carriers wrecked but not destroyed, which means you need them broken in a way that leaves reactors intact and drones collectible, which means the moment the fighting turns, you'll steer it towards salvage and away from safety, and if our people are standing where the salvage is richest, you'll spend them because we're prey to you too. Aren't we? We're just prey you can use. She held up a hand before Vashti could answer. Don't insult me by denying it. I trust you less. Yes, we have a deal, Vashti Serrano, but understand what kind. You are not our ally. You are a knife we've decided to hold by the handle instead of the blade. The instant you become the blade, we let go. Vashti Serrano threw back her head and laughed, a real laugh, delighted, and her metal hand clicked as she slapped the arm of the chair. Oh, I like you, old woman. I like you enormously. Everyone I've ever worked with pretended we were friends. You're going to be so much easier to work with because you'll never once forget what I am. She stood, still grinning. Fine, a knife held by the handle. Just remember I've got the same grip on you. So the table was set. 3 hungers and the smallest one at the head of it, holding the only thing the other 2 wanted, and the whole terrible genius of Renata Vane's plan resting on a single bet. That neither the Empire nor the thief would ever look at 11,000 malnourished miners and a boy who talked to machines and see anything but meat. Contempt was the water they swam in. Contempt was the thing Renata meant to drown them both with. Up on the bridge of the Unarguable, Oran's sensor officer flagged the arrival of the scavenger hull, and Oran glanced at it and dismissed it. A carrion ship. They gathered at the edge of every reclamation like flies at a slaughter, hoping for scraps the Empire left behind. It was beneath notice. He noted only that the scavenger had docked with the human station rather than fleeing, and he took this correctly as a sign that the humans were desperate enough to bargain with vermin, and incorrectly as further proof that they were beaten. Desperate prey made deals. Deals took time. Time favored the collector. He extended the humans' deadline by a single rotation, a small generosity that cost him nothing, and he went back to the pleasant boredom of a job nearly done. Cass Renner did not sleep that night either. He sat in the astronomy loft with the stolen handshake code glowing on Renata's oldest slate, and beside him, Vashti Serrano's ship brain fed him schematics of the Vorthan carriers, real schematics, salvaged from wrecks, worth more than the whole station, handed over because the scavenger had decided the boy was a tool she could use, and a tool she could not use was worth nothing to her. Cass read them the way he read everything, slowly with his fingers looking for the valve, and somewhere in the 3rd hour, deep in the drone control architecture of a 4-kilometer subjugation carrier built to swallow worlds, he found it. A seam. A place where the arrogance of the design had left a door only latched, because no one at the other end had ever been anything but cattle. He sat back. His hands were shaking, and not from fear anymore. "Hey," he said softly, to the machine, to the schematic, to the vast, patient gray thing waiting in the dark above him with 10,000 collars in its holds. "Hey, you dramatic old monster, you never once thought somebody down here might learn to talk." He touched the seam on the slate, gentle, the way you touch a solenoid you are about to pop free. "It's just a valve. It's always just a valve with your kind." He almost smiled. "Let me show you what a cow can do." The days of the stall were the strangest days Halcyon Drift had ever lived, and the people who lived them would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain the particular texture of that time to anyone who had not been there. They were performing surrender in the daylight of the station's cycle, and building an ambush in its shadow, and the two things had to be woven together so tightly that a Vorthan eye watching from orbit would see only a beaten wheel rolling over. So the surrender had to be real. That was Renata's rule, and she enforced it with a cold patience that frightened people more than the carriers did. The long gray lines of the reclaimable had to actually form. The labor records had to actually be compiled. The children had to actually be brought to the collection points and counted, in view of the drones, and then quietly, in the seams between one drone pass and the next, folded back into the deep decks where the barricades were rising. Every gesture of obedience the Empire could see had to be genuine enough to survive scrutiny, and every act of defiance had to happen in the half-second of dark between one Imperial glance and the next. 11,000 people learned in 4 rotations to live 2 lives at once, the owned life the Empire watched, and the unkilled life underneath it, and the effort of it hollowed their faces and sharpened their eyes, and without any of them quite noticing, welded them into the single stubborn thing that Renata needed them to be. Cass spent those days living 3 lives instead of 2, because on top of the surrender and the ambush he had the machines. He barely slept. He barely ate the gray protein bricks Das kept pressing into his hands. He lived in the astronomy loft with the stolen handshake glowing on Renata's slate and Vashti Serrano's salvaged schematics scrolling beside it. And he learned the drone architecture of a subjugation carrier, the way he had learned every machine on the drift, not from the outside, as a thing to be attacked, but from the inside, as a thing to be understood, coaxed, spoken to low and patient and unafraid. He found that the Vorthan machines were beautiful and stupid in exactly the way their masters were. They were built to obey authority codes without question, because the Empire had never once, in 900 worlds, needed to imagine that anyone but the Empire might learn to speak with authority. Their obedience was total. And total obedience, Cass understood, turning the thought over the way he turned a fouled solenoid, was the softest thing in the galaxy, because a thing that cannot disobey cannot refuse a lie. Twice during those days, the fragile weave nearly tore. The first time, a drone on a low pass caught the heat bloom of a barricade being welded 3 decks down, and its logs flagged the anomaly. And for 11 minutes the whole station held its breath while the flag climbed toward a Vorthan officer's attention. And Cass, hunched over the slate with his hands shaking, reached into the drone's memory in its own protocol and did not delete the flag, because a deleted flag is a scream, but instead retagged it quietly. As a routine thermal fluctuation in a failing station's plating, authority signed unremarkable. The flag reached the officer as noise. The officer dismissed it. Cass sat back and was sick into a waste bin and then went back to work. The second time it was not a machine that nearly tore the weave. It was Vashti Serrano. The scavenger grew restless in the waiting. She was a predator built for the lunge, not the crouch, and 3 days of pretending to be a docked carrion ship, while the richest salvage of her life hung in the sky above her scraped her patience raw. On the 3rd rotation, she came to Renata's room of dead screens and said, flatly, that she was done waiting, that every hour they stalled was an hour the Empire might reinforce, that she wanted to hit the carriers now while surprise was whole. And Renata, who had known this moment would come, who had built the whole plan around the certainty that a hunger cannot be made to wait past its own appetite, did not argue with the scavenger. She agreed with her. "You're right," Renata said. Surprise is the whole weapon and its spoils. So here's what we'll do. We'll spend it the moment it's worth the most, not the moment you're most bored. She laid it out on the dead glass, cold and clear. The surrender was not a delay, it was the trap's own jaws, and the trap only shut once. And if they sprang it an hour early, they would waste 11,000 lives and one scavenger's guns on a carrier that was still watching. You want a lunge, Renata said. Good. I'm going to give you the fattest, softest, most unwatched throat you've ever put a gun to. But you only get it if you let the Empire turn its back first, and the Empire only turns its back if it believes, right up to the last second, that it's already won. Your impatience is the one thing that can tell it otherwise. She held the scavenger's eyes. I can't stop you leaving, but if you lunge early, you lunge alone and you die alone, and the Empire files you under vermin and goes back to its arithmetic. Wait, and I'll hand you the Empire's blind side on a plate. Vashti Serrano looked at the old woman for a long moment, her metal hand clicking slowly as she flexed it, pricing the promise the way she priced everything. And then she laughed her real delighted laugh and dropped back into the chair like she owned it. You're the most dangerous person I've ever met, she said, and you've got dead screens and a boy and 11,000 people who have never fired a shot. It ought to be funny. She wasn't laughing anymore. It isn't. All right, old woman, I'll hold my hunger. But when the throat opens, it opens for me first. That's the price. It opens for you first, Renata agreed, and did not tell her because Renata never told anyone the whole plan. That opening for the scavenger first was exactly, precisely, what the third part of the reckoning required. On the last night before the deadline, Cass climbed to the astronomy loft one final time and sat with the schematics and the stolen language and the vast gray certainty waiting in the dark above him. And Das Yarrow found him there and sat down beside him without a word, and after a while the old foreman said, "Your father used to talk to the Orcracker like that. Lo, like it could hear him. Drove the shift bosses mad. They said a machine's a machine, you point it and you use it." Das was quiet a moment. He said no. He said everything's got a way it wants to be treated, even the dead metal, and if you learn it, it'll do things for you it won't do for anyone who only knows how to point. Das looked at the boy, at the long forearms and the knuckles gone thick too early, and the face still trying to grow its beard. The Empire only knows how to point, Cass. That's all they've ever learned. 900 worlds, and they never once learned to listen to the thing they were pointing at. He put a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. You did. You've been listening your whole life because the station never gave you anything but machines to talk to. Turns out that was the one skill in this whole black sky that could kill them. He stood, his knees cracking. Get an hour's sleep if you can. Tomorrow you point their own certainty at their own throat, and I want your hands steady when you do. Cass did not sleep, but he sat with the machines in the dark, low and patient and unafraid. And somewhere in the last hour before the deadline, the fear in him finally went quiet, not because it had left, but because the thing underneath it had grown at last to be larger than the fear. The old, mean, unkillable refusal of a small creature to be counted before it was dead. When the station's lights came up for the final rotation, and the long gray lines began to form for the last time, Cass Renner wiped his hands on the rag at his belt. An old habit, the gesture of a boy about to start a difficult job, and went down to teach an empire the number it had forgotten how to fear. The plan had 3 parts, and Renata Vane named them the way she named everything plainly, so that frightened people could hold on to the words. The first part she called the stumble, the second she called the greed, the third she called the reckoning, and she would not explain the third part to anyone, not even to Cass, not yet, because a plan spoken aloud too early is a plan already halfway to the enemy's ear. The stumble came first, and it was Cass Renner's. On the 4th rotation, when the extended deadline came due, Halcyon Drift did exactly what a beaten thing should do. It began to comply. Its docking spine lit its running lanterns in the surrender pattern the Vorthans had specified. Its people, 11,000 of them, began to file toward the collection points in long gray lines, carrying the labor records the Empire had demanded, moving with the shuffling obedience of the already owned. From the bridge of the unarguable, it looked like every reclamation Auron had ever run. It looked like arithmetic completing itself. And Auron, satisfied, gave the order to deploy the collection drones. This was the thing the whole plan turned on, and Renata had bet the station on it, that the Empire would not come down to Halcyon Drift itself. Why would it? Vorthans did not dirty their own hands with collection. They sent machines. 10,000 collar drones spilled out of the carrier's bellies and streamed down toward the docking spine in a long silver river, autonomous, obedient, each one running the drone control architecture that Cass Renner had spent 3 sleepless nights learning to whisper to. He was ready for them. He had been ready for 2 days. As the first wave of drones crossed the threshold of the station's own systems, as they reached out, per their arrogant design, to handshake with the local network so they could catalog the meat they were about to collar, Cass answered them. Not with a weapon, not with a virus, nothing so crude the Vorthan minds would flag it. He answered them in their own protocol, in the raw handshake language he had stolen from the Empire's own broadcast, and he told them a small, quiet, entirely reasonable lie. He told them the station's gravity plating was failing. He told them, in the language they could not disbelieve because it came wrapped in their own authority codes, that the docking spine was drifting out of alignment, that their approach vectors were 3 degrees off, that they should correct, gently, automatically, without troubling their masters about it, to compensate. They corrected, all 10,000 of them in perfect obedience, 3 degrees off from where they meant to be. And 3 degrees, across the length of a 4-kilometer docking approach, is the difference between a collar around a throat and a drone flying full into a structural spar. The first wave of the Empire's collection fleet did not land on Halcyon Drift. It crashed into it. 10,000 drones, each certain it was flying true, buried themselves in girders and dead ore haulers and the station's own scarred flanks, a silver river pouring itself into rock, and where they struck they crumpled and sparked and died, and 11,000 humans in their long gray obedient lines dropped flat behind the barricades they had been building for 4 days under the cover of surrender, and were not there when the collars came. On the bridge of the unarguable, alarms Auron had not heard in a decade began to sing. Report, his voice had not risen, it never rose. Subjugation-master, his drone officer's membranes had gone pale. The collection wave, its 9,000 units are non-responsive. They've impacted the station. All of them, they flew into the structure. Malfunction. No malfunction. Their logs are clean. They executed a corrective maneuver. A legitimate corrective maneuver, authority signed our own codes, and it flew them into a wall. The officer looked up, and for the first time in this whole tedious reclamation there was something on a Vorthan face that did not belong there. Subjugation-master, the station told them too, in our own protocol, something down there is speaking our language. Auron was silent for a long moment. He was not a stupid creature, whatever else he was. He had broken 40 worlds and he had never once been surprised, and he understood, standing on his bridge above a rusting wheel he had filed under reclaimable, that he had just been surprised, and that the sensation was not fear, not yet, but the cold, clean thing that comes before fear, the thing a professional feels when the ground he has always trusted shifts a half-degree underfoot. They have breached our drone architecture, he said slowly. A Category 9 species, petroleum burners. He let the wrongness of it settle. Then, because he was what he was, he did what the Empire had trained 900 worlds of subjugation masters to do when the arithmetic broke. He escalated. Recall the second wave. Do not send drones. Prime the cutting batteries. If they wish to be difficult, we will stop collecting and begin correcting. Target the station's outer ring. Show them what the difference is between being reclaimed and being destroyed. And here the second part of Renata's plan opened its mouth, because Renata had known, had bet the station on knowing, that a strong thing, humiliated, does not grow careful. It grows angry, and an angry, strong thing reaches for the biggest weapon it has and stops watching the small ones. The cutting batteries of a subjugation carrier were not meant for war. They were meant for demolition, for slicing a resisting hab block off a captured station like a rotten limb, and when Oran ordered them primed, the Unarguable and its two sisters rolled their vast blunt flanks toward Halcyon Drift and began to charge weapons that could carve the station in half. It would take 4 minutes to charge them. Renata had counted on 3.5. Because the moment the carriers turned their flanks to bring the cutting batteries to bear, they turned those same flanks away from the small, ugly scavenger ship that had been sitting quietly, ignored, beneath notice, docked against the station's shadow for 2 days. And Vashti Serrano, who had been watching her sensor board with the still patience of a woman who has spent 30 years waiting for exactly one kind of moment, saw the Empire present its unguarded side, and she keyed her ship-wide channel, and her scarred face split into a grin that 30 years of the Empire's leavings had sharpened to a knife. "There it is," she breathed. "There's your soft belly, you gray bastards. There's what 40 years of running feels like." And to her crew, to the Vorthan killer guns, she had pried off the wrecks of everyone who'd tried this the honest way and failed. Fire. The second mistake came off the station's shadow like something loosed from a trap. It salvaged guns, real guns, reactor lances and mass drivers stripped from a dozen dead fleets, spoke all at once into the exposed flank of the nearest carrier, the one Oran did not command, the sister ship called the Inevitable, and they spoke into exactly the seams that Vashti Serrano had spent 30 years learning to find. Not the armor. The Empire built its armor to face forward, toward the enemy it expected. She fired into the vents, the coolant lines, the drone bay doors hanging open from the aborted collection, the soft, unarmored throat a subjugation carrier only ever showed to prey it had already stopped watching. The Inevitable convulsed. Fire walked down its flank. Its cutting batteries, half-charged, discharged into their own housings, and the ship staggered out of formation trailing a long, bright ribbon of its own burning air. Oran watched his sister ship reel, and the cold, clean thing before fear finally became fear. And for the first time in 40 worlds, subjugation-master Thel Vex Oran said a word he had not said since he was young. "Hell." Down on Halcyon Drift, in the room full of dead screens, Cass Renner watched the Inevitable burn on Renata's oldest slate, and felt something turn over in his chest that was almost joy and almost grief, and mostly just the vast disbelieving vertigo of a boy from a rusting wheel who had just watched a piece of the Empire that owned the sky begin, impossibly, to die. Beside him, Renata Vane watched too, and her face did not move, because Renata was already 2 moves ahead, already listening for the sound she knew was coming, the sound that meant the second part of her plan had done its work and become dangerous. She heard it. It came over the open channel from the second mistake, in Vashti Serrano's purring triumphant voice, and it was aimed at the humans, and it was exactly what Renata had known it would be. "Beautiful," Vashti said. "Absolutely beautiful little wheel. 1 down, 2 to go, and the down one still got its reactor whole. That's mine, that's my cut, and it's drifting free right now with nobody minding it." A pause, and under the triumph, the thing Renata had been waiting for, the thing that made a knife a blade. New plan. "You keep the big gray one busy with your drone tricks. I'm going to peel the reactor off that cripple before it burns through, and if I have to shove your station between me and the other carrier's guns to do it, well. You understand. Business. Nothing personal. It's just arithmetic." It's just arithmetic. She had thrown Renata's own contempt back at her, and she had meant it, and every soul in the room understood that the scavenger had just announced, in the middle of the fight, that she would spend Halcyon Drift for salvage the instant the salvage came due. The knife had turned in Renata's hand. The blade was out. Das Yarrow swore. "She'll get us all killed. She'll park us in front of that carrier's guns to buy herself 30 seconds at the reactor." Yes, Renata said. She said it calmly. She had known it for 2 days. She had built the whole plan around knowing it. She will. She's exactly what she told us she was, right to the last decimal, which is the only honest thing about her. She turned from the screens, and now, finally, she looked at Cass, and Cass saw that the third part of the plan, the reckoning, the part she would not name, had been about this all along. Not about the Empire, not about the scavenger. About the moment when both of them, the vast one and the hungry one, would be so busy tearing at each other, and at the salvage between them that neither would remember to watch the prey. Cass, Renata said, 2 questions, truth, not comfort. He wiped his hands on the rag at his belt. Ask. That crippled carrier, the inevitable. It's burning, but its systems are still up, its drone architecture, its navigation, all of it. You cracked the seam on the schematics. Can you still speak to it? Even now, even burning? Yes. He did not hesitate. He had found the valve 3 nights ago, and he had been holding it in his mind ever since, turning it, learning it. Its master's dead or its bridge is gone. Nobody's answering my handshakes with authority codes, which means nothing up there is arguing with me. It's a 4-kilometer ship with a whole mind and nobody home. Yeah, I can speak to it. He swallowed. Renata. What do you want me to make it say? And Renata Vane, 60 years old, small, standing in a room full of dead screens above a cracked moon she had never left, at the head of a table of 3 hungers where she had always been the smallest and had never once been the weakest, told the boy who talked to machines what she wanted the burning ship to do. And Cass listened, and his eyes went wide, and then wider, and then something came into his young face that had not been there before, something that would be there for the rest of his long, strange life. The specific and terrible expression of a person who has just understood that they are about to win, and understood exactly what winning will cost, and decided, the way their whole stubborn species has always decided, that expensive is better than owned. They think they're hunting us, Cass said quietly. It was not quite a question. They've thought so since before they arrived, Renata said. The Empire and the thief both. That's the whole gift, Cass, that's the only card. Every move they've made, they made it certain they were the hunters and we were the meat, and they never once looked up from their own appetite long enough to count what was really at this table. Her lined face was very still and very old and very calm. So we're going to let them keep believing it, right up until the moment it kills them. Go, talk to the burning ship. Tell it what we agreed. And Cass, she caught his arm as he turned, and her grip was surprisingly strong and her voice dropped low. When it's done, they're going to want to know who did this to them. The Empire keeps records. It'll want a name for the disaster, something almost like a smile. Make sure the name it writes down is ours. Cass Renner went up to the astronomy loft, and he sat down with the stolen language of an empire that had filed his home under reclaimable. And above him in the dark 2 of the 3 hungers at the table turned all their strength and all their greed against each other over a burning ship and a whole reactor drifting free. And neither of them, not the subjugation-master nor the scavenger, spared a single thought for the rusting wheel between them, or for the boy inside it, quietly reaching out one more time. Patient and low and unafraid, to whisper to a 4-kilometer war machine the last thing it would ever hear. What Renata Vane had asked for was this, that the burning carrier stop being a wreck and become bait. The inevitable was dying, but it was dying slowly, the way a 4-kilometer thing dies, and it had a whole reactor still whole in its belly, and a whole drone mind still running in its bones with nobody left alive on its ruined bridge to give it orders. To Vashti Serrano, it was the richest salvage of her 30-year life, drifting free and unminded, worth more than every scrap she had ever pulled from the Empire's leavings. To subjugation-master Oran, it was a humiliation he had to erase, a sister ship struck down by cattle, a wound in the arithmetic that had to be cauterized before it spread. Both of them wanted it. Neither of them could have it while the other lived, and the boy in the astronomy loft had his hands on its controls. Cass did not make the ship do anything violent. That was the genius of it, the part that made Renata's plan a reckoning and not just a trick. A violent move would have been noticed, flagged, answered. Instead, he made the burning ship do the one thing that both a proud empire and a hungry thief were absolutely certain to misread. He made it look like it was trying to run. He fed its dead navigation a slow, limping burn, a wounded thing crawling for the deep dark, listing, venting, pathetic. And he aimed that crawl along a single specific line that Renata had drawn for him, a line that threaded the narrow black between the second Vorthan carrier and the salvage-hungry second Mistook, a line that ran directly across the one patch of sky where the Empire's guns and the scavenger's greed would have to reach through each other to stop it. Vashti Serrano saw the crippled carrier begin to crawl away with her salvage inside it, and every instinct 30 years had built in her screamed that she was about to lose the reactor, and she did exactly what a hunger does when its meal starts walking off. She lunged. The second Mistook broke from the station's shadow and burned hard after the fleeing wreck, guns hot, crossing open sky, thinking of nothing but the reactor. And subjugation-master Oran saw the crippled inevitable trying to flee the scene of its own defeat, saw it limping toward the deep with the scavenger in pursuit, and every instinct 900 worlds of conquest had built in the Empire screamed that a subjugation carrier must never, ever be allowed to fall into scavenger hands intact, that the drones and the collars and the reactor and the codes could not be permitted to become salvage for vermin. So he did exactly what a proud thing does when its property tries to walk off into the wrong hands. He fired, not a warning, everything. He brought the full cutting batteries of the unarguable and its second sister to bear on the fleeing wreck to deny it to the thief. And he did not once stop to wonder why the wreck was fleeing along that particular line, because he was a hunter, and hunters do not ask why the prey runs where it runs. The prey ran there because Renata Vane had drawn the line so that when the Empire fired to deny the wreck to the scavenger, and the scavenger fired to tear the wreck from the Empire, both of them would be firing through the same narrow patch of black, through each other, with a boy's whisper holding the wreck itself steady in the exact center of the crossfire, a burning 4-kilometer hinge on which the whole trap turned. They fired. The Empire's cutting beams and the scavenger's reactor lances met in the dark, in the space between the fleeing wreck and its two pursuers, and for one instant the black above the cracked moon lit up like a second sun. But that was not the trap. That was only the noise. The trap was the thing Cass did in the half-second before the beams landed, the thing Renata had bet the station on, the last quiet lie in a war made entirely of quiet lies. Because the Inevitable's reactor was still whole, and its drone mind still answered him, and in the instant that both the Empire and the thief committed everything they had to the narrow line of the wreck's flight, Cass Renner stopped telling the burning ship to run. He told it to stop, to turn, to open every containment seal it had, all at once, in the exact center of the crossfire, and to point what came out at the unarguable. A subjugation carrier's reactor is not a bomb. It is worse than a bomb, because a bomb is designed and a failing reactor is not. It is a 4-kilometer volume of contained catastrophe that has been told, very precisely, in its own protocol, by a voice it could not disbelieve because that voice wore the Empire's own authority codes to stop containing. The inevitable came apart along its whole burning length in a single silent blossom of light, and it did not come apart evenly, because Cass had not asked it to. He had asked it to fail directionally, to spend its death along one vector, the way a cutting charge is shaped, and the vector he had chosen. The vector Renata had drawn 3 nights before on the schematics the scavenger herself had handed them, pointed straight up the unguarded throat of the unarguable, which had turned its flank to fire and had never turned it back. The flagship of the reclamation took the death of its own sister full in its open side. On the bridge of the unarguable, in the last 4 seconds of his life, subjugation-master Thel Vex Oran watched the sky he had ruled for 40 worlds turn white, and he understood, with the terrible clean lucidity of the very experienced meeting, the very impossible, exactly what had been done to him. He had not been beaten by a fleet. There was no fleet. He had been beaten by his own contempt, aimed and folded and handed back to him by a species he had filed under reclaimable, a species that had never once shown him a gun because it had never needed one, that had let him and the thief tear at each other over a corpse it was steering, that had spent his own arrogance the way he had meant to spend their lives. His last thought was not fear. Fear was 4 seconds ago. His last thought was the number he had left out of the sum, the one column no Vorthan survey had ever had, and the fact that he was dying inside it. The unarguable died with him. The blast rolled it end over end, split its stem to spine, and where a 4-kilometer instrument of conquest had hung above the cracked moon, there was only expanding light and the long, slow rain of a broken thing falling toward a star. 2 carriers were dead, and the second mistake, which had burned hard into the crossfire chasing a reactor that no longer existed, took the edge of the inevitable's directional death across her salvaged flank and reeled, half her guns gone dark, her scarred hull open to the black. There was 1 carrier left, the third sister, the Recompense, which had hung back at the edge of the formation as a reserve, and which now found itself the sole surviving strength of a reclamation that had come to inventory 11,000 petroleum burners, and had instead lost 2 capital ships and a subjugation-master in the space of a single minute. Its commander, a cautious officer named Vess who had spent the whole affair uneasy at the edges of uncertainty, did the one thing the Empire almost never did. She hesitated. And in that hesitation, 3 voices reached across the black at once, and the last shape of the thing became clear. The first was Vashti Serrano, wounded furious, her purr gone to a rasp. "You," she snarled on the open channel, and it was aimed at halcyon drift, at Renata, at the boy she had handed the schematics to. "You steered that. You steered all of it. You used me, you used my guns, my salvage, my greed. You drew me across that line knowing the Empire would fire through me to stop the wreck, a ragged breath. You played me exactly the way you played them. Same trick, same contempt. You looked at me and you saw a hunger you could aim, and you aimed me right into the Empire's guns and out the other side. And then, impossibly, through the fury, a sound that might have been a laugh, might have been grief, from a woman who had spent 40 years being the smartest predator at every table she sat at, and had just discovered she had never once been the smartest predator at this one. 40 years, little wheel. 40 years I've fed off these gray bastards and called myself the clever one. And a boy from a rusting station and an old woman with dead screens just used me for a lever, and I never felt the hand. The second mistake was already turning, already limping for the deep salvage forgotten. I'm leaving. I'm leaving and I'm not coming back, and I'm going to tell every port in this sector what happened here because they won't believe it, and I want to be the one who says it first. You want to know what you are. You're not prey. You never were. You're the thing that lets everyone think it's prey until the trap's already shut. One last rasp, and under it, unwilling, something almost like respect. God help whatever hunts you next. The second voice was the Empire's, Commander Vess of the Recompense, broadcasting on every band at once the way Oran had on the first day. But there was no boredom in it now, and no certainty, and no arithmetic. There was a question, and the question was the sound of the whole Vorthan ascendancy, 900 worlds deep, feeling for the first time in living memory the ground shift a full degree beneath its certainty. Halcyon Station, the Empire said, and it had never before in the history of the reclamation used a station's name. You will identify the party responsible for the destruction of this reclamation fleet. You will identify your fleet, your allies, your weapons. The ascendancy does not. There was a pause, a real pause, a pause with something underneath it that had never been in an imperial broadcast before. The ascendancy requires to understand what has happened here. And the third voice was Renata Vane's, small and old and calm, in the room full of dead screens, speaking into the channel the Empire had opened, giving the surviving carrier the answer she had promised Cass she would make sure the Empire wrote down. She did not gloat. She did not threaten. She told the truth, which was the most frightening thing she could have done, and she made sure the boy who talked to machines was standing beside her when she did it, so that the Empire would have the name right. "There's no fleet," Renata said. "There never was. There's a mining station and 11,000 people you called reclaimable, and one scavenger you called vermin, and a boy you never counted at all. That's the whole force that killed your carriers. You did the rest yourselves. We just held the door open and let your Contempt walk through it." A pause of her own, and Cass, standing beside her, watched the old woman deliver the sentence that would travel further than either of them ever would, the sentence the war colleges of a dozen species would eventually carve over their doors. "You want to understand what happened? Here it is, and take it home to whatever counts you. You came here certain we were prey. And we let you keep being certain, right up until it was the last thing you'd ever be. Go home, Empire. Tell them the number you left out of the sum. Tell them the humans were never the easy part. Tell them we were the ambush the whole time." The recompense did not fire. That was the thing that told Cass Renner, more than the two dead carriers or the fleeing scavenger, that something enormous had shifted in the black. He stood beside Renata in the room full of dead screens, and watched the last surviving carrier hang motionless above the cracked moon, its guns cold, its holds full of collars it would never use, and he understood that Commander Vess was doing something no Vorthan officer had done in the memory of the reclamation. She was thinking. She was weighing a station of 11,000 petroleum burners and finding, in the ruin of two capital ships, that the arithmetic had inverted so completely she could no longer trust a single number she had brought. Because Vess did not know what had beaten her. That was the poison of it, the thing that would spread from this cracked moon across 900 worlds. She had watched her flagship die, and she could not say how. There had been no fleet. The sensors showed no fleet. There was a mining wheel and a wounded scavenger, and a voice on the channel belonging to an old woman and a boy, and that voice had just told her calmly that the Contempt of the Empire had done all the killing itself. And Vess, who was cautious, who had been uneasy at the edges of Oran's certainty from the first rotation, believed her. That was the worst part. She believed her completely, because it was the only explanation that fit, and it was so much more frightening than a fleet. A fleet you could outbuild. A fleet you could outnumber, outgun, drown in the endless strength of an empire 900 worlds deep. But you could not outbuild a species that turned your own certainty into the weapon. You could not outnumber a thing that fed on your contempt and grew stronger the more of it you brought. Every soldier the Ascendancy sent would arrive certain the humans were prey, because that was what the records said, what the surveys said, what every subjugation-master's instinct said, and that certainty was the ammunition. The more sure the Empire was, the sharper the trap. Vess understood, hanging dead, still in the dark, that the Ascendancy could not send a force large enough to be safe, because the size of the force was measured in the size of the Contempt, and the Contempt was the thing killing them. She opened a channel. She did not broadcast to the station. She broadcast to the Empire, the long, slow burst that would take weeks to crawl back across the deep to the frontier command on Maris, and Cass, who was still holding the stolen handshake open, still listening in the language he had learned, heard every word of it, and knew, hearing it, that the disaster Renata had built was no longer a battle. It had become a story, and a story could reach places a fleet never could. Reclamation failed, Vess sent, 2 carriers lost. Subjugation-master Oran lost. Cause of loss, the subject species. She paused, and Cass heard her choose the next words the way a person chooses words for a thing they do not want to be blamed for but cannot leave unsaid. Recommendation. Reassess Category 9. Reassess all reclamation doctrine against this species. The humans did not resist our strength. They used it. They allowed the assessment of prey to stand because the assessment was their weapon. Any force sent against them in the certainty of easy conquest will arm them with that certainty. She stopped. Then, at the end, 4 words that would do more damage to the Vorthan Ascendancy than any human fleet ever could, because they came from inside, from a loyal officer, from the Empire's own mouth. Do not underestimate them. And then the recompense turned, slowly, with the terrible dignity of a thing that has learned something it can never unlearn, and it burned for the deep dark, back the way it had come, and it did not fire a single shot, and it left Halcyon drift alive. For a long moment, no one in the room full of dead screens spoke. The station's dimmed lights hummed. On the slate, the crimson mark that was the last carrier crawled toward the edge of the plot and at last off it into the empty side, gone. Then Das Yarrow made a sound that Cass had never heard the old foreman make, a rough, broken sound, and it took Cass a moment to understand that Das was laughing and weeping at the same time. And then the room was full of it. 11,000 people's worth of it pouring in over the channels from the barricades and the collection points, and the creche where the children had been hidden. A whole station of the reclaimable finding out all at once that they had not been reclaimed, that they were alive. That the thing that had filed them under a word for a harvest, already counted, was fleeing into the dark with 4 words in its throat that would poison every survey the Empire ever ran again. Cass Renner did not laugh. He sat down, very suddenly, on the floor of the room full of dead screens, and his hands were shaking, and he looked at them like they belonged to someone else. 19 years old. He had never left the station he was born on. He had lost his mother to the 3rd level and his father to the silica, and everyone the Black had ever given him, and the station had kept him only because he could be useful. And now the useful thing he had done was end an Empire's certainty with a whisper. He felt no triumph. He would tell people later, across the long, strange life that this day opened for him, that there had been no triumph in it, that a person does not feel triumph when they have spent a burning ship's death and a scavenger's greed and a subjugation-master's arrogance all in one terrible minute. What he felt was the thing that had been under his fear from the very first, showing him its whole face at last. Not courage, something older. The flat, stubborn, unkillable refusal of a small creature to be counted before it was dead, and the vast, quiet, terrible discovery that the refusal had teeth. Renata Vane crossed the room and lowered herself down beside the boy, her old bones creaking, and she sat with him on the floor the way you sit with someone who has seen too much too fast, and for a while she said nothing at all. Outside the single-scarred port, the cracked moon turned its gray face to the sun, indifferent as ever, and the black above it was empty of carriers for the first time in a week. "You want to know the thing I couldn't tell you," Renata said finally. "The 3rd part, the reckoning, why I wouldn't name it." Cass nodded. He did not trust his voice. Because the reckoning was never the ship's, Cass. She looked out at the empty black where the Empire had been. Anyone can wreck a ship if they're lucky and desperate enough. The reckoning was the story, the one that carrier just carried home. From today, every soldier that Empire sends anywhere to any world it's ever called prey carries a little more doubt in his belly and a little less contempt, and contempt was the only thing that ever made them fast. We didn't beat a fleet today. Her lined face was very calm and very tired and very old. We beat the thing that made them dangerous. We beat their certainty, and you can't rebuild that in a shipyard. It's gone. We took it. 11,000 miners and a thief and a boy who talks to machines reached up into the sky and took an Empire's certainty away, and they are never, ever going to get it back. She put her hand on the boy's shoulder, and her grip was strong. That's the disaster we made them, Cass. Not 2 dead carriers. A whole empire that will never again be sure it's the hunter. That's the greatest disaster you can hand a thing that only knows how to hunt. The story of the Halcyon reckoning left the cracked moon in 3 directions at once, and it moved faster than any ship. It went home with the recompense, into the frontier command on Maris, where Prefect Ashan Val Carrick, who had provisioned 3 subjugation carriers to inventory a species, and had lost 2 of them and a subjugation-master to a rusting wheel, read Commander Vess's report and did not laugh. He would never laugh at the human system again. He filed the 4 words, "Do not underestimate them," and he tried to bury the affair, and he could not, because the second direction the story went was with Vashti Serrano. The scavenger kept her promise. She limped the wounded second mistake from port to port along the Empire's ragged edge, and everywhere she went she told the tale, and she told it well, because she had 30 years of the Empire's contempt in her and 40 years before that of being called reclaimable herself, and she had finally seen the contempt turned into a blade. She told it in the salvage yards and the smugglers' holes, and the free ports the ascendancy had never quite managed to swallow, and she told it against her own pride, because the best part of the story was that she, Vashti Serrano, the cleverest predator at every table, had been used for a lever by a boy from a mining wheel and had never felt the hand. People believed a thing like that precisely because no one would invent it to make themselves look foolish. The story spread the way fire spreads through a granary. The Empire had spent 900 worlds packing full of the reclaimable, the conquered, the collected, the ones who had been filed under a word for a harvest already counted, and every one of them, hearing it, felt the same small, terrible thing kindle in the belly that had kindled in Cass Renner in the room full of dead screens. Not courage, something older. The discovery that the refusal has teeth, and that the teeth had a name now, and the name was human. And the third direction the story went was the strangest, and the one Cass understood the least at the time, and the one that mattered most in the long run. It went into the Empire itself, not to its prefects, to its soldiers, to the crews of the subjugation carriers and the pilots of the collection drones and the low-born career pacifiers like Oran, who did the actual breaking of the actual worlds, and who now, every one of them, carried into every reclamation the memory of a flagship dying to its own certainty above a cracked gray moon. You cannot make a soldier hunt well when he has stopped being sure he is the hunter. The Ascendancy's whole engine of conquest ran on contempt the way its carriers ran on reactors, and the humans of Halcyon Drift had opened the containment and let the contempt bleed out into the dark, directionally aimed, and it never came back. Worlds the Empire would have swallowed in a season, it now approached with caution, and caution gave the reclaimable time, and time was the one thing that had ever let a cornered thing become expensive. Within a decade the frontier the Ascendancy had spent 2 centuries pushing outward had stopped moving. Within a generation it had begun, quietly, world by doubting world, to fall back. Historians of a dozen species would argue for a long time about where the great empire's long retreat began, and they would trace it, every time, back through the archives, to a single failed reclamation and 4 words in a cautious commander's report, and to the name the Empire itself had written down for the disaster, because Renata Vane had made sure the Empire got the name right. They wrote down human. Cass Renner lived a long time. He left Halcyon Drift at last. The boy who had never once left the station, he was born on stepped off it a month after the reckoning, because a species that had just taken an Empire's certainty needed people who could talk to the Empire's machines, and there was only one of him. He was not a soldier, and he never became one. He was, to the end of a long, strange life, exactly what he had always been. A young man who talked to machines low and patient and unafraid, who could find the valve in anything, who understood better than anyone alive that the strong are only strong along the axis they expect to be tested and soft as rot everywhere else. He taught others the stolen language. He grew old teaching it. And when they asked him, as they always asked him, how 11,000 miners had broken the empire that swallowed 900 worlds, he always gave the same answer, and it was always the answer Renata had given him on the floor of the room full of dead screens, and he always gave it in the third person, as if it had happened to someone else, because, in a way, it had happened to everyone. They came certain we were prey, he would say. That was their strength, and it was the only weapon we ever needed, because they handed it to us themselves. An empire that is sure it is the hunter will walk its own arrogance straight into the trap and call the walking arithmetic. We didn't outgun them. We didn't outnumber them. We just refused to be counted before we were dead, and then we let them keep believing we already were, right up until the moment it became the last mistake they'd ever make sure of. They mistook us for easy prey. And in the whole long history of that empire, in 900 worlds of conquest, it was the single most expensive certainty any of them ever held. It cost them their carriers. It cost them their subjugation-master. And in the end, world by doubting world, it cost them the one thing an empire built on contempt can never buy back and never survive losing. It cost them the certainty that they were the hunters. And the humans, the reclaimable, the malnourished, the Category 9, the harvest already counted, took that certainty up off the black above a cracked gray moon, and they never gave it back. And the greatest empire the galaxy had ever built spent the rest of its long, unraveling learning the one number it had left out of the sum. That the most dangerous thing in all the dark is a small, stubborn creature that has decided it would rather be expensive than owned, and has just found out that its refusal has teeth.